Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and ACRL, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Using Primary Sources to Understand Today's Events, the Lasting Impact of the War in Ukraine, which is sponsored by ProQuest, part of Clarivate. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice and ACRL that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All of the attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions that you like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom right corner of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Alastair.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're watching this from. As I said, I'm here in London, very centre of London, and our speaker is also in London. Just in case you want to know where London is, it is, of course, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Anyway, this is the annual Edmund Burke Lecture, which the Annual Register of World Events puts on each year with a distinguished speaker. This year, we're particularly delighted to be doing it in partnership with the Association of College and Research Libraries in the US. This is a tremendous compliment to the lecture that they've taken us on board, and we in turn are grateful to them for the work that they do throughout the year. ProQuest, Clarivate, who are our publishers, have been tremendously supportive throughout the year, as they are each year, so thank you to them too. Just a quick reminder, it's the Edmund Burke Annual Lecture. Burke was, of course, a writer, a moral philosopher. He was a member of Parliament here in Britain, but he was founder and first editor of the Annual Register of World Events. He lived from 1729 to 1797, and he's a key figure in the story of these islands, but also of America, because he was very, very pro-American, and at the time of American independence, supported it vigorously. I'd like to acknowledge that the Annual Register has been published every year in print form, and now, of course, online since 1758. I think if you reflect on that for a moment, it's pretty remarkable that through every war, through pandemics, through whatever interruptions to history or part of history there's been, the Annual Register has appeared. It's a record today of what has happened in every part of the world, every sovereign nation, every small island. And it also records what's happened in the arts, in the economy, in the law, in science, in music, and so on. We contain documents, crucial documents of the year. It's illustrated with photographs that tell us the story of the year through visual imagery. And it also carries the text of the annual Edmund Burke Lecture. And we look forward to that being the case with Michael Clarke's. So I do highly commend it to you as a unique publication, which tells the story really of the human race since 1758. We couldn't be more proud and pleased to have Professor Michael Clarke as our lecturer tonight giving this lecture. His subject, as you know, is using primary sources to understand today's events, the lasting impact of the war in Ukraine. He's a great specialist in that part of the world and, of course, in conflict. He did have a working title beforehand, which perhaps says a bit more informally what he hopes to be talking about. That was A New Europe Since February. Welcome to the real 21st century. Michael Clarke was the Director General of the Royal United Services Institute from 2007 to 2015. The Royal United Services Institute is the world's oldest defense and security think tank. Its stated mission is to inform, influence, and enhance public debate to help build a safer and more stable world. There can't be a more monumental enterprise than that, and he presided over it for a significant number of years. Prior to his work at the Institute, Michael taught at the universities of Manchester and Newcastle, and then became Professor of Defence Studies at King's College, University of London. He's published very widely, many articles and chapters and books, including Global Development and Human Security, published in 2007. He's on television, he's a media person. He's absolutely the right person to be engaging with the terrible problems that face Ukraine in particular, and implicitly the rest of the world and all of us. So can I commend Professor Michael Clarke to you? Enormously look forward to the lecture that he's about to give. Thank you very much, Michael, for being here.
Alastair, thank you. And let me say, yeah, it's a great honor to give the Edmund Burke Lecture in favor of the annual register. It's a terrific publication. I mean, any publication that goes back to 1758 and has maintained its consistent record of world events is quite a remarkable achievement. And I know it commends itself to the Association of Librarians and to those in the profession of information science and librarianship. And it's also a great honor to speak in the name of Edmund Burke. You know, Edmund Burke, he spoke truth to power. He was a philosopher, a politician, as you say. He castigated the British government for its opposition to American independence, for trying to resist American independence in the 1770s. He was vehemently opposed to the French Revolution, not because he opposed the ideas of liberty, fraternity, and equality, but because he opposed the violence with which they were being pursued, because he was a man who cared about institutions and society. He cared about the need to preserve institutions and the need to honor what is the fabric of society. And he was prepared to stand up for that and be very unpopular, as well as then later on in the story becoming very popular, because he had tremendous integrity. And he had a sense that you can see the difference between right and wrong, that it's not something you have to agonize about all that much. There is a difference. There is a rational difference between what is right and what is wrong. And he was guided by conservative principles of institutions and society. And so it's a very great honor, I think, to speak, as it were, in his name. And in this lecture that I was asked to give, I wanted to talk about war and the problem of research, the problem of speaking truth to power in a time of war. I mean, truth, as they always say, is the first casualty of war, and that's almost always the case. But also it's important to be able to put conflict in perspective, because warfare is it takes on the edges of human emotions. You see some of the best of human life, but you see the worst as well, quite a lot of the worst of human behavior in times of war and conflict. And it's very difficult to maintain perspective when that happens. And so what I'd like to do in this lecture is, first of all, to talk about the war in Ukraine, and then to talk about the ways in which we might try to, as we use primary sources and look at the sources that are available to us at the moment, in order to get a better handle on it and to get some perspective on it, so that we might be in a position to tell truth to power as we understand it better. So let me talk about the war itself to begin with. Ukraine, first of all, is there. I hope everyone is sharing that map. It's a map of Europe and the region, Middle East and North Africa region. I put that out because it just shows where Ukraine is. It's quite a big country. It's the biggest single territory in Europe, apart from Russia itself. And Russia, of course, is a Eurasian country. It's Europe and Asia. So amongst the strictly European countries, Ukraine is the biggest land area. It's a country of 44 million people. You know, we talk about the big four in Europe because of size and population. The big four are France, Germany, Italy, and Britain. Those are the big four. You just look at their populations, look at their size, look at their relative importance to what goes on in Europe. France, Germany, Italy, United Kingdom. But Ukraine, as it becomes more Europeanized, is number 5. We have to start speaking in 10 years' time or so, I guess, of the big 5, because with 44 million people, a big land area, it is a food-producing superpower in Europe and in the world. It produces about 20% of all the grain that is consumed in the world, of the sunflower oils, which are critical to food production, and a lot of other agricultural produce as well. It's a vast agricultural producing area, and it's quite industrialized in the east, in the eastern third of the country, and agricultural in the western 2/3 of the country. And you can see too why Ukraine matters to Russia, because it's a big country, because it was intrinsically part of the Soviet Union, and before that it was intrinsically part of Russia at certain times in history. But also, let's not forget that Kiev, or Kyiv as we call it these days in deference to Ukrainian language, you know, Kiev is the Russian pronunciation, Kyiv is the Ukrainian pronunciation, but Kyiv was founded in the year 482. It is much older than Moscow. The Grand Prince of Kiev in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries were the senior princes among the peoples of Rus, as it then was. Ukraine was the cradle of the Slavic civilization that then became Russia later on. And Kyiv celebrated its 1,500th birthday in 1982, founded in 1982. So it's much older than Moscow, much more distinguished than Moscow. And you can see why, from Moscow's point of view, they hate the idea that Ukraine is somehow separate, that Ukraine is independent, because it's intrinsically part of Russia. But for the last 150 years or so, the Russians also denigrated Ukrainians. They used to call them little Russians. That was the way they referred to them, little Russians, as if it wasn't really part of Russia proper. It was just a territory that Russia had control over. And of course, it was the subject of the great imperial conquest by Catherine the Great. Just as Peter the Great conquered the Baltic territories, so Catherine the Great conquered the coastline of the Black Sea to add to the Russian Empire. And that's something that's quite important to the Russians now. So that's Ukraine. And the reason that it matters is because it matters because of international law. Europe has been really turned upside down in ways that the world has forgotten about in the last 20 or 30 years. The Cold War came to an end between 1989 and 1991. So 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, November the 22nd, and 1991, literally at the end of the year, the turn of the year, the Soviet Union went out of business as a country, just stopped existing. And so in those 2 years, 4 countries stopped existing. So the Soviet Union stopped existing, East Germany stopped existing, Czechoslovakia stopped existing as a single country, and Yugoslavia began a process of dissolution where it stopped existing within about 18 months of that. So 4 countries went out of business, and no fewer than 23 countries replaced them. 23 countries. So 4 went out of business, 23 countries replaced them. And Russia itself, the Soviet Union, became 15 different states. Russia plus 14 other states. And that's a huge revolution in European politics. And by and large, apart from the Bosnia crisis, which was fairly nasty, but could have been a great deal worse, apart from that crisis in the 1990s, the process has been very peaceful. But there have been 2 occasions, actually 3, but two dates, 2014 and 2022, when borders have been changed by force. And those in every case were by Russia. So in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine and first of all grabbed Crimea. And then secondly, using separatists, grabbed the Donbass region, Donetsk, or about a third of Donetsk and about a third of Luhansk. And that was the only time since 1945 that European borders have been changed by force. And in 2022, the Russians did it again. So that was the third time. They've tried to change borders by force. And just a month ago, President Putin declared annexation for the 4 oblasts, the 4 regions that the Russians are fighting in. And so for Kherson, for Zaporizhia, for Donetsk and Luhansk, he now declared, well, these are Russian. The fact that he doesn't control more than half of those areas is irrelevant to him. He's just declared that they are now Russian territory. So he's changing borders by force for the first time, or in his case, the third time since 1945. So the war matters because European security is absolutely on the line with this war, as is the question of the rules and society of the international system. We all used to think that President Putin's Russia was just a nuisance. It was a real nuisance in European security, but that if it would only become a strategic threat if we let it, and we shouldn't let it. We should just accept the fact that it will be a nuisance. It will be an edgy, difficult power that will always cause problems, but we'll get over it. But on February the 24th, the world changed, as I made the point to Alastair when we were talking about this lecture. The world changed fundamentally because President Putin made it very clear that his intention is to overturn the post-Cold War settlement and create something different in a way that threatens many of the peoples of Europe and the bases of Europe itself. And it also represents this war. The other reason why it's a new world is it's a return of industrial warfare to Europe. We thought we'd seen the end of it with the Second World War, industrial warfare, by which I mean the side that will prevail in this war is the side that is able to mobilize its resources and apply them to the battlefield of Ukraine. And Russia is a big country, it has many resources, and it is steadily doing that. It's applying more and more resources. The Ukrainians are fighting with Western resources, they're fighting with our resources. And so we too, if we are going to continue to back Ukraine for the next, 1 to 2 years, let's say, then we have to gear up our production because the usage rates of weapons is phenomenal, and we're not producing weapons to send to Ukraine in the numbers that they will need by this time next year. And the Ukrainians, remember, need at least $5 billion a month, $5 billion a month, just to keep going, just to keep the government on track. And so it's using up big resources from the West. This is the return of industrial warfare to the continent of Europe. And as such, we thought we wouldn't see this again, at least not for many, many years, but we do. So let's just think about this conundrum a little bit more. This is the man who created it all. He tends to be called Vladimir the Indefinite. He became leader in 1999. He was made prime minister by Boris Yeltsin, and he used the Chechen war, the Second Chechen War, to be completely ruthless and consolidate his power. And he's changed the constitution now more than once. He's changed it twice, and he could be in power till 2036. That's the way it now runs. If he lives that long, if he's not removed, in theory, he could be there till 2036. And the point about President Putin is that he is a KGB man, and he thinks like a KGB man, but he was never a particularly senior KGB man. He is now what he always was. He was the regional head of the KGB in Dresden. He wasn't even the head of the KGB in East Germany, in Dresden, a small city. And he moved very rapidly from being a regional KGB manager to going into the government, to becoming prime minister, because Boris Yeltsin, who was extremely quixotic, thought he could use him and manipulate him, but of course he couldn't. And his ruthless side then came through. And suddenly this man from nowhere became a ruthless leader in 1999. And that's quite important, because this is what he really worries about. Just look at this map. This is a map of, in a sense, of what the Soviet Union lost when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is when Putin was in Dresden. This is when he was a KGB local chief, and he was appalled by what he saw. And so the territories, they're engraved there, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then Belarus, that was all part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Moldova, to the west of Ukraine, was part of the Soviet Union. So was Azerbaijan, so was Armenia, so was Georgia. And then there was the stands, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all of the very small countries of the stands, all of that on the map was the old Soviet Union, and it all dissolved into 15 separate states. And Putin regards that, as he said very explicitly, as a tragedy. It's a catastrophe. He said that in 2013. He said what happened in 1991 was a catastrophe. People went to bed in one state and woke up in another. And he said we must devote all of our efforts to trying to reverse the effects of this. Now, he didn't by that mean direct conquest, but he meant reverse the effects in terms of Russian influence, because he regards it as a historical injustice that the Soviet Union was fragmented into these states. But of course, it was fragmented because peoples in those states decided that they wanted to be independent, but he's never really accepted that. So that's the first thing that really worries Putin as a KGB man, that the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And the second thing that really worries him is this, which is NATO. And this is a comparative map. On the left, there's NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Originally, it was 12 states in 1949, and then it got to 14, 15, 16 states. That's the map as of 1982 on the left. And so you see there, the dark blue is the NATO frontier, and the red is the old Warsaw Pact. And that was a pretty stable frontier. It was quite dangerous, of course. There were lots of near misses during the Cold War in terms of crises that might have got out of control. But we all understood where the boundaries lay. And that boundary went right through the middle of Germany, of course, between East and West Germany. And it split Europe in half in a way that was not pretty, but it worked for a while. But you look at the map on the right, and that is a sort of chart of all the enlargements that NATO has conducted. So it enlarged itself after 1949, in 1952 and 1955, and then 1982, and then 1990, and then 1999, 2004, 2009, 2017, 2020, and now 2022, as Finland and Sweden are about to join. They are being kept out at the moment by the Turkish parliament, or by President Erdogan's manipulation of the Turkish parliament, but it will happen. And the point is that NATO has enlarged itself 9 times since it was founded, and 6 of those 9 enlargements have been while Putin has been sitting in the Kremlin, and that really affects him. And so the line I've drawn on that map, you can see that dark line, that's now the NATO line. That's the line that used to run through Germany, now runs that line where it is. And that line is now 1,000 miles nearer to Moscow than it was, 1,000 miles. And Putin sees security in very 19th century terms. Angela Merkel used to say he's a 21st century politician who thinks in 19th century ways, because he sees security as a matter of territory. And what he sees is NATO territory coming closer. And his war in Ukraine, of course, has provoked Finland and Sweden to join the alliance. And their membership of the alliance is the most important enlargement since German rearmament in 1955. That was a big enlargement. The enlargements that have been since then have been lots of countries that didn't really add a lot, Poland accepted. But Sweden and Finland, that's a big enlargement. And you know, there was a joke going around when they announced quite suddenly that they wanted to join NATO. And remember, Sweden has been independent since 1812, and Finland had been independent since 1945. And both of them said, we want to join NATO. And the joke that was going around, it was a Russian joke, is that President Putin was in the Kremlin discussing with his advisors the possibility that there might be a nuclear war. And Putin said, oh, it won't matter because all the Russians will go to heaven anyway. But heaven overheard him and applied to join NATO. That was the way the Russians saw it. They're very good at jokes, the Russians. Anyway, that map on the right is what really worries Putin. And so it represents what for him is a deep insecurity which has been growing and which he intends to push back. And the point about this is that you can see in his statements the way his aims in this war have been inflated. It started off as a war to remove the leadership of Ukraine, because Ukraine, he said, was being run by Nazis and criminals and drug addicts. It wasn't representing the people of Ukraine. It was acting against Russia's interests, and the West was encouraging this Ukrainian degeneracy. And so we've got to take it over. And that was the initial rationale. And then it was coupled with a second rationale, which was that we've also got to defend the Russian speakers in the Donbass, those people who had seceded illegally in 2014 and in Crimea needed to be protected from all these Nazis and drug addicts and criminals in Kiev. And so we've got to do something about helping them. And that first rationale that we can't live with Ukraine like this any longer then transmuted itself into really this map. He then said, we've got to push NATO back. NATO has enlarged itself far too much, and NATO thinks it can keep on enlarging itself. And there's a big story there, which I won't go into now, but we could talk about in questions. But that NATO has kept on enlarging itself, and the time has come to push it back. And that's exactly what China thinks. Xi Jinping in China very much agrees with that. And so that became the second rationale. But as the war has gone wrong for Putin, and as he's had to mobilize Russian society much more, as he's taken some real pain in society with sanctions, lack of components for weapon systems and cars that are being produced, for instance, without airbags and various other things. As that's happened, then it's become a third, deeper rationale. And the rationale is that Russia is being effectively attacked by the Western world. And the Western world is trying to undermine the Russian people with its LGBTI, its gays, its degeneracy, its ridiculous elections. And they point to, you know, Britain and America in the last 10 years, where we've made fools of ourselves in so many ways in our elections. And he said all of this is an attempt to undermine the Russian Slavic nation. It's a battle of civilizations. That's what he tends to think. And so you can see that as the war has gone on, the aims have developed from doing something about Ukraine to doing something about NATO, to doing something about the Western world's fundamentally civilizational clash with Russian peoples. And for that reason, this war has become very serious indeed, whether Putin survives it or not. A lot of people in Russia now agree with roughly that interpretation. And for that reason, this antagonism, however long the fighting actually lasts, is likely to go on for some time. So let me just briefly then talk about what is actually happening on the ground in Ukraine. That's the map that we tend to look at, the map of Russian gains in Ukraine up to about a month ago, showing Russian forces moving into Luhansk and Donetsk, the two breakaway republics, taking about 2/3 of those republics, whereas they used to have about a third, occupying Crimea, and also moving to Kherson, which is the Kherson Oblast down in the southwest, which is the key, of course, to Mykolaiv and Odessa. The attempt to take the whole coastline, of course, which is part of the Russian battle plan in order to landlock Ukraine. If they took the whole of the coastline right through to Odessa and further west towards the Moldovan border, then Ukraine would be landlocked with Russia and Belarus on its northern borders. Not much that the Ukrainians could do apart from work westwards with Romania and Poland. That's the way the battle looked about a month ago. This is the way it looks now. If you look at the blue in the top there, that's Kharkiv Oblast has been completely recovered by the Ukrainians, and they're now pushing against the Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk, and there's some ferocious fighting going on there. And of course, this week in south in Kherson, the Ukrainians look as if they are able now to take Kherson. The Russians are withdrawing from the city. We're not sure how that will actually work out or what it will mean, how it will work. But that withdrawal from the city is important because that's the only city that the Russians have taken, the only big city they've taken, and now they look as if they're withdrawing because the Ukrainians have conducted a very good campaign and are beating the Russians on the ground with increasing rapidity. So the battlefield is moving now quite quickly. And I'm happy to spend all day talking about this on the media, but happy to talk about any other aspects of it. The other two things about the battlefield, which I think are important, are one, that this is a war of extremes in the sense that it is both a 21st century war and a mid-20th century war, or even an early 20th century war. It's a 21st century war because things like Starlink are really important to it. SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, has made 3,000 satellites available, Starlink satellites, these very small satellites, which are communication satellites, and they work on GPS, which is commercially available. But there are so many of them that you can't jam them all at once, and you can keep changing the modalities with which the downlinks work. And so making Starlink available to the Ukrainians, as Elon Musk has done, has been fundamental to their ability to be agile on the battlefield. They've made the Russians seem very flat-footed. The Ukrainians have got excellent battlefield communications, and that derives from a commercial system, remarkably cheap compared to military systems, and my goodness, it works very, very well. So on the one hand, that's a real 21st century development that's both commercial and high-tech, just when it's needed. But on the other hand, there is a real early 20th century battle going on in the trenches, in the mud, in the need for warm clothing over the winter. The Ukrainians have got much better winter gear than the Russians have got, in their supplies of food, in the logistics. All the things that our grandfathers and great-grandfathers knew very, very well are being relearned in the mud of Ukraine, and they will be relearned again in the ice of the winter, which is not far away. Temperatures in Ukraine during the winter fall to usually between -5 and -10. But if there is an anticyclone over Siberia, they go to -20. And that's life-threatening if you haven't got good winter gear. We'll see what happens during this winter. So it's a battle of extremes. But the other thing, which is what I want to move on to now, it's a battle of the narratives. It's a battle of evidence and truth. And the most important factor in this is look at the United Nations General Assembly resolution that was just held in March, just not long after the invasion took place. 141 nations lined up in the UN General Assembly roundly to condemn Russia's invasion. 5 of them supported the invasion. That was Russia plus 4 allies like Cuba and Syria and North Korea. So 5 of them voted in favor. 141 voted, sorry, 5 voted in favor of the Russian action. 141 voted to condemn it. 35 nations abstained. And so effectively 40 nations did not condemn it and 141 nations did. But those 40 nations who did not condemn the invasion represent more than 50% of the world's population. And that in a way is the symbol of what has happened since the war began, that most of the world is standing back. They're waiting to see what happens. And my friends and interlocutors, for instance, in Africa, African journalists and so on, they say that the general mood in most of sub-Saharan Africa is, we don't really care who wins. This is a battle between autocrats and hypocrites. Why do we care? We care about food, we care about prices, we care about oil and so on. And we're not morally fussed by this, although for Europe, this is very fundamental. And so for that reason, this is a real battle of the narratives. And of course, lots of things are said, which are really quite completely untrue, really completely ridiculous. Both sides have said things which are untrue. I mean, a good example of the Ukrainians is that they created the image of a fighter pilot in the early part of the war. And they made up this man who was anonymous. He was only ever seen in his helmet, couldn't see his face. And they said he was a super ace. He'd shot down 40 different Russian aircraft. Completely untrue. They just made it up. And that was the Ukrainians. They shouldn't have done it because it reduces the credibility of other things they say. But the Russians have told lie after lie after lie. And they just make things up. So they blame Britain for being behind the attack on the Kherson Bridge, famously on the 8th of October, which made everybody in Britain laugh. They blamed America for being behind the explosion in the gas pipelines, the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines under the Baltic. And again, it just made everybody laugh. And they lied and lied and lied about the fact that they were only conducting exercises in February. Remember that these exercises were building up to 190,000 troops. And Putin said repeatedly to Macron, who went 3 times to Moscow to talk to him, to other world leaders who just went in and out of the Kremlin to say what's going on. And he said, no, there will not be an invasion. He said it repeatedly. And, you know, it was about 10 days before the invasion that some of us, we knew that there would be something, because in these exercises the Russians were producing or were exercising with, they brought hospital units forward, which is unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual. But then they brought blood stocks forward, real valuable blood stocks. Now, you don't bring real blood to an exercise unless you intend to do some fighting. And that became clear then, that this was not being exercised and that they would do something. We just didn't know what. So Let me now turn for 15 minutes or so to this question of the sources. How do we understand this crazy war, this battle of the narratives, a war of extremes, and a war that is a war of apparently unlimited aims, at least on the Russian part? Well, first of all, what are the primary sources? Most of the primary sources don't yet exist, or at least they're not yet available. The sort of primary sources that people will be looking for in the next 6 months or a year are the after action reports, which are produced in the Western world. And so there'll be lots of lessons learned reports, some of which will be publicly available. There's always a classified version, and then there's usually a public version. And so the British military is working all the time on looking at the lessons of this campaign, both political and military. I get involved in some of those discussions, and some of that paperwork will find its way into the public space, in the next 6 months to a year. And so there will be some primary source material, which has to be looked at very carefully, of course, because you have to always to put it in context. There are also primary sources in the official documents that already exist. So, for instance, the NATO's Madrid summit document, the communique, and the documents around it. They're very interesting because when NATO went to Madrid a few weeks ago, the tone of their documents was very, very specific. It was very determined to show that NATO would oppose Russia every step of the way in this crisis. And you wouldn't have read that at the Wales summit in 2014, which is the previous big summit, where the NATO they came to Britain. It was something that was to be in Britain, and it was held in Wales for local reasons. And at the Wales summit, there was a lot of toughness in that communique, and NATO agreed to do lots of things over the next 4 or 5 years to beef up its defenses. But at the Madrid summit, NATO had sort of taken the gloves off, and to read those two documents, the 2014 document and the 2022 document side by side, is a very interesting exercise in looking at primary sources. You get a really good sense of it. Equally, United States defense policy guidance, national security guidance, those documents produced by the Pentagon. You can compare them from 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and this year, which they're now out, I think. And they're very interesting because although they're official and they're meant for the wider public, if you look at them carefully, you can see the nuances, you can see the priorities, you can see where the governments intend to put their resources and put most of their emotional commitment. And then there's a very interesting primary source document that President Putin produced in July last year, July 2021, with Kovalchuk, Yuri Kovalchuk, who was one of his old friends from the criminal fraternity in Petersburg. And Kovalchuk is a great mystic. And Putin produced this long, rambling 10,000-word document on the history of Russia in July last year. And when it came out, those of us who are interested in all this stuff, we read it and we said, good grief, this is really very important, because in that document, he revealed that he had a completely odd view of Russian history. It didn't accord with anyone else's view of Russian history. And it was reimagining Russian history in such a way as to reduce the legitimacy of Ukraine as an independent state. It just tried to rewrite the history. It was full of mystical references to the mystical mission of Russia in the civilizations of the world. It was the old messianic idea. And so those sorts of documents, and I would recommend, if you're interested in Ukraine, have a look at the July 2021 document, and it was called on the history of Russian civilization. I think it was titled rather like that. It was a very interesting document. And there was another interesting document that came out. And again, these are primary sources if you're in looking at the war. And that was a document that came out from the Russian Ministry of Finance, because it didn't intend to give away what it really gave away. The Russian Ministry of Defense is very careful what it says in any documents, of course, but the Russian Ministry of Finance needed to produce a document which listed the amount of money that had been dispensed to families of soldiers who had been killed in action. And it was a huge amount of money. And if you divide the amount of money they said they dispensed by the amount of money we know they give to families where soldiers have died, it turned out that the Russians had lost far more people than they ever admitted to, and that their losses were running at that stage at about 25 to 30,000 dead, which meant about 100,000 dead or injured. And that was something, that was a document, and it was authenticated. And again, quite a lot of work went on to make sure it wasn't a plant or a fake. It was an authentic document. It leaked out. It was a governmental document, but it had in it very interesting information, which by implication can tell you something that you won't find out elsewhere. And I'll come back to why that sort of thing should be important. So one can look around for primary sources. They're not that many because the war is ongoing. We're still in the 8th month of the war, towards the 9th month now. It'll be about a year to 2 years before there is a raft of primary sources that will be important. But the second element here is unique to the Ukraine war, and that is the immediacy of some evidence. This war is characterized more than any other war, and they've all been moving in this direction in the last 20 years, but this war is really characterized by immediate images, immediate comment, immediate information. Some of it's wrong, some of it's deliberately lies, a lot of it is not, a lot of it's true. And so I've never known a conflict, for instance, in which war crimes were a matter of evidence virtually from day one. Normally, war crimes are something of an afterthought in a conflict, that when the conflict has moved on, then people come to thinking about war crimes and pulling together evidence of something that might have happened a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever. From day one, evidence of war crimes has been there, and it's been growing, and it's being collected by organizations in Britain like Bellingcat, in the States by Maxar. And the point is that they're collecting all of this information, they're archiving it. Bellingcat has done the same for the Syria war, and it will be there forever. It can't be burned, it can't be destroyed, it might be denied, but the evidence, and there's huge amounts of it, can be archived, it can be interrogated by artificial intelligence, and it will not disappear. It is there forever. And that's quite unique. And so that's changing the dynamics in which war crimes are discussed. And so the conflict itself presents a massive amount of immediate evidence, which is both good for the researcher, but also creates many, many problems. Even in Russia, the Telegram channels, for instance, reveal all sorts of things. I mean, a couple of weeks ago at Pavlivka, the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, the Russian Naval Infantry Brigade, that's Marines, from the Pacific Fleet, who have been sent from the Pacific Fleet to fight in Ukraine. A lot of information started to go around on the Russian Telegram channels that this unit had suffered catastrophic losses at Pavlivka. And the Russian Ministry of Defense said, well, the losses have been between 1% and 2%. Nobody believed it, because already there was anecdotal evidence that they'd had a disastrous time and that they'd suffered something over 50% losses, have basically been taken apart. They've basically been destroyed as a brigade at Pavlivka. And so, we will see, even in Russia, information does tend to get around. It's not all true, of course, but it gets around. There are many, many personal stories, lots of photoshopping goes on. So you see lots of images of Ukrainian soldiers, and then an image will appear a couple of days later. And in the background, if they put their kit down, their kit bag might be behind them in the first photograph. In the second photograph, the kit bag has suddenly acquired a swastika. And the Russians let that go for a couple of days, and then they start to circulate and say, look, these Ukrainian soldiers are actually Nazis. Look at them. And it's never very obvious. They would never put a swastika on the front of somebody's uniform. They would put it somewhere at the edge of the picture, as if it's only just been discovered by some eagle-eyed journalist, and then put that round. There's a great deal of that going on. And as I say, it goes on for both sides. There's an organization called NAFO, NAFO, which are the NATO fellas, and they are, I think, almost all men, and they are the bloggers and I call them the train spotters out there, and they're doing a very valuable job. But they've started to make cyber war on Russian forces by circulating material. And again, a lot of it is very good material, but some of it isn't. They tell lies as well. And I wish they didn't, because it destroys the credibility of some of the other things that they do. Most of what they do is very good and very interesting, and some of it is extremely funny. But when they Photoshop material and try to misuse it, doesn't do the cause any good at all. And then Anonymous, the blogging group Anonymous, they have taken on the Kremlin by trying to cyber attack Russian systems, both on in the field of battle and in central Russia, and just cause the Russians as much mischief as possible. You know, Anonymous is not regarded very favorably by Western governments because usually it turns against everybody in the West and institutions in the West. But in this case, they've turned their mischief on Russia. So there's a great deal of immediate evidence. And so finally, my point is, what do you do with it? How do you react to this immediate evidence? Well, it's all journalism. You know, it's often said that journalism is the first rough draft of history. That's what journalism does. It's the first rough draft of history. And I believe that's true. And I've always thought as a research director that really good journalists are very similar to really good researchers. They have to do the same things. They do them for a different purpose, and they write things up differently. I mean, a journalist would not write a research paper for a serious journal, but the material that they collect has still got to be collected in the same meticulous way if they are good journalists. And most, you know, a lot of journalists are not good journalists, but those who stand out because they are fundamentally good researchers. And I always say, and I used to say this to my researchers, that the principle is what I call CVC. There was the three things, CVC. This is my own version of it, which is corroboration, verification, and context. And what I mean by that, corroboration, first of all, it's very like journalism. We say, how many sources have you got for this information? Most good journalists say, I need 3 sources. 2 is not enough. I need 3 sources, separate sources, who tell me the same thing or tell me roughly the same thing. And then I'll believe that it could be true. Not is true, but could be true. So first of all, the first is corroboration. You need more than one source. But secondly, verification. One of those extra sources needs to be something different, not just 3 people from the same area or the same family saying the same thing. You're looking for verification. So you're looking for something that's cross-cutting, that triangulates the material in some other way. There was a famous case where this did not happen. In the build-up to the Iraq War in 2003, British and American intelligence sources ended up quoting each other when they were trying to establish the fact that the Iraqis had been involved in mining yellow cake in Central Africa, yellow cake ore for the use in uranium for nuclear bombs. And this came from a single report from a husband and wife American group, a team, who just got it wrong for a range of different reasons. There was a big issue about that. But because the British heard about it, they wrote it into their intelligence reports, and the Americans wrote it into their reports. And when those reports were questioned by people who knew that yellow cake, or thought it was very unlikely that yellow cake was being mined by the Iraqis, when they were questioned, the Americans said, oh, yes, well, the British confirm it. And when the British were questioned, they said, yes, the Americans confirm it. It was the same piece of material being recirculated. That was fundamentally wrong. That's fundamentally what intelligence sources shouldn't do. And researchers shouldn't do it either. So verification of the corroborative sources, they've got to triangulate from different areas. And then the third element is what I call context. And this is the fact, does it feel right? Does it seem right? And this is where one relies on your gut instinct, on experience, on being around, on going to, in my case, war areas of conflict, and just talking to people and knowing what's happening and just getting a sense of the way things work. Does it feel right? It sounds vague, but sometimes this is the most important of the CVC areas. If something doesn't feel right, then you've really got to go back on the corroboration and the verification. So, for instance, you know, the United States blew up the pipelines, the gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea a couple of months ago. Well, that's just out of context. It would never feel right. Because it's not what they do. And the argument was a conspiracy theory. They said, oh, well, the Americans want to sell LNG gas, liquefied natural gas, to Europe. By blowing up the pipelines, they guarantee that Europe will have to buy American gas. Obviously, it was the Americans because there is an economic motive. Well, that's conspiracy theory. It's out of context. It's not right. It doesn't feel right. The Americans would never do it. If they were found out doing it, it would destroy their position, and they would be found out eventually doing it. Similar thing arises now. The Russians are trying to create the expectation that the Ukrainians might create a radiological device, a radiological bomb, to create an explosion with lots of radiation in it from hospitals and different waste product from reactors, to create a radiological catastrophe somewhere in Ukraine. They're trying to create the situation where people believe the Ukrainians might do it. The context doesn't work at all, partly because if the Ukrainians did do it, that's the quickest way to lose the war. Because forensically, it would become fairly clear within a couple of weeks who was behind that sort of attack, whatever Capital said about it. And if the Ukrainians were stupid enough to do it, it would become clear that they did, and the West would stop backing them. Simple as that. So the one single act the Ukrainians might commit that would lose them the war would be a radiological device. So that's a sort of an obvious example of where something simply doesn't fit the context, doesn't work. So corroboration, verification, and context, those are the things that matter when one's trying to grab hold of the only primary sources we have in the middle of a war, which is this immediacy. It's a very rich information environment. I've never known one that was richer than this in my experience of looking at wars and conflicts for 30 odd years. But its richness is also a problem because we've got to work very hard to be careful what we say, be careful what we follow, and I think apply my CVC, corroboration, verification, context, guidelines when we look at them. This war is a fundamental test for our democracy and a fundamental test for our intellectual honesty in the way that we analyze it and the way we learn from it. But to be honest, you know, I'm at times like this, as an academic all my life, I've been a research director and all the rest of it, but I'm basically an academic, and I'm proud of my profession. And I'm proud of the profession of librarianship. My wife was an information scientist in the chemical industries. She's a librarian, basically. I'm proud of our profession of knowledge and understanding and intellectual rigor and truth. And I think that Edmund Burke will be proud of what we are trying to do, which is to hold on to civilized values, to hold on to society and institutions in the international world, which are under such dreadful threats at the moment. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching.
Thank you so very much. We do have a couple of questions that keyed up for you here. One of them would be, do you have any advice on or thoughts on how to provide context to the primary sources you mentioned? You mentioned Bellingcat, for example. Who are they? Who are some of the main characters involved? And any other sources you might see as emerging on the war of Ukraine, especially for like students and early researchers? And what maybe librarians can do to help, what they can do to help share trustworthy resources on this war.
Yes, I mean, I think you've got to check them out. I mean, Bellingcat, I happen to know Bellingcat quite well. I know the people who run it, and it is what it says it is. And they're attacked all the time by the Russians, and the Russians have tried to place false stories with Bellingcat's name on them to try to diminish them. And Bellingcat always are forensic in what they do. They don't produce stuff so quickly. They stand back until they know they can get it right, which is always a good sign. So one thing in terms of researchers' work is you've got to get to know the ones you trust, and there's no magic formula for that. But I think if you've got to look through what they produce and see that there is quality in it. Usually, when these organizations are producing material fairly immediately, you can see 3 or 4 months later whether they were right. If they were wrong, or if they were pushing a conspiracy theory, that's normally fairly clear 3 or 4 months afterwards. And so I think that's that's worth thinking about. Institute for the Study of War is very good. For instance, the ISW produces material which is very conservative. I mean, I think everyone uses their maps. A lot of the journalists use the ISW's maps, Institute for the Study of War, and I think their maps are too conservative. The way they shade where the Russians are and where the Ukrainians are, they wait until they're very, very certain that the Ukrainians fully occupy an area before they shade it in as occupied. And the maps I showed you in the presentation were from ISW. The real situation is almost always a bit more favorable to the Ukrainians than those maps say. But that's a good sign. That's a good sign. And again, you can check back on ISW's material. I mean, they look at other conflicts as well. They've done a lot on Taiwan. They do a lot on Syria. They've done, they look at conflicts in Africa, and they look at lots of other conflict-related issues. But if you track them back on Ukraine, you will find that they've got a good record of turning out to be right, and they've not peddled, that I'm aware of, any conspiracy theories that wouldn't stand the test of time. Maxar are also very good. They tend to concentrate on, again, American, they tend to concentrate on satellite images, and they look at them very, very carefully. And again, you know, commercially available satellite images are great. Anybody can get them, but you've got to have the skill to know what you're looking at. And I worked with a man called Bhupendra Jasani at King's College, who was the best in the business years ago. There was an Indian scientist, and he knew how to interpret what he saw on the ground. He'd been in the defense business for a while. And I learned from him how I would not trust myself to interpret a satellite photograph, even if I thought, oh, those are obviously tanks, and those are obviously trains bringing tanks. I wouldn't trust myself. You've got to be specialist to know what you're looking for. And I'd say distrust people who just throw something onto Twitter to say, look at this photograph, it shows this, it shows that. Stick with the organizations who've got the track record, because they are the ones who have the specialists, many of them ex-military or ex-intelligence, who know how to look for things.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came up, Mikhail Gorbachev used to talk about the common European home when working to end the Cold War. What will it take for Russia to be invited back into that home?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, I mean, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, and he said, you know, the night before he took over, when he knew he was going to the meeting that would declare him to be the chairman. And the night before, he walked in the garden with Reza, his wife, and they had to walk in the garden because they knew they were being overheard in their own house. That was the way even the leadership were being overheard by the KGB. So they walked in the garden the night before he would become the supreme leader of Russia. And he said to Reza, he said, according to his memoirs, he said, you know, we can't go on like this. We've got to change. We cannot keep competing in the way that we have, because we're losing. We have to change our society. And he was very clear about that. However, I mean, he wasn't such a natural liberal. He was very popular in the West because he did and said things that we liked. But he was also, I mean, he never intended the Soviet Union to come to an end. He just lost control of the process. So he created a process of glasnost and perestroika, you know, reform and transparency. And we loved that in the West, but he lost control of it. And the reason that he was so unpopular in the Soviet Union, then in Russia, was that he was seen as a man who essentially made them all poorer and worse, that his ambitions didn't work. But he spoke, part of his, we've got to do it differently, part of his idea that we can't carry on like this was that we must think in terms of a common European home. And that was very conducive to the liberals in Europe, of which I'm one, who said, look, that's a great idea. Let's just try and evolve our way out of the Cold War to understand. And we looked at the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, as a possible framework. And maybe we can beef that up and do different things. And we can rework the architecture of Europe to give Russia a place that is acceptable and which we can all live with. Of course, it all came crashing down in 1991, and Russia then was very, very poor once the Soviet Union had become Russia. And we went in for Wild West capitalism and encouraged them to a situation in which essentially the state was stolen by a group of oligarchs. And now we are where we are with Russia. And the problem, I mean, to get to the nub of the question, it'll be a long time before the Russia that we see in front of us now has got any ideas of a common European home, common European security, because this war is not only Putin's war, it's the war of the Siloviki, the security apparatus, the military and the security people around him. And so this group of the Siloviki, plus the 20 or so oligarchs around him, I don't know if they're all in favor of the war, but they are behind his attempt to push the West back and to do something about Ukraine. And after 20 years of constant propaganda about this, constant harping on this, large sections of the Russian population feel the same way as well. And there is a great yearning for some sort of return of the Russian Empire. A lot of Russians say, well, you know, we lost the Soviet Union, where we should get back to the sort of Russia that we had, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and then Joseph Stalin, when Russia counted for something. And the idea that the Russia has been humiliated over the last 20 years goes very deep in Russian political thinking. So sadly, I think it will be the leader next but one after Putin that we might be able to deal with. Putin will not be replaced by a nice man. He will be replaced, and it will be a man, that we can be certain about that, but he will be replaced by somebody who thinks pretty much like him. And I think he will be replaced sooner rather than later, for what it's worth. But he'll be replaced by somebody who's very like him, or worse, somebody like Patrushev. Might be Patrushev's son, that might be possible. But it'll be the one after that that we might be able to then begin to get back on terms with. But this is a long process, and it's very depressing for those of us in Europe. This is a dark prospect that we are facing now for the next 5-10 years, or at least.
Oh, well, thank you. I just realized it's 3 o'clock, and
I'm sorry.
No, it's been excellent. Alastair, would you? I think we're about at the end of our time. Would you like to say a couple of concluding remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you enormously to Michael Clarke for an absolutely brilliant lecture. I think everyone will go away feeling a bit more doubtful about what they thought they were certain about. We've had very strong prejudices, certainly in my part of the world, and obviously there are in Russia too, but there are nuances to this whole struggle that's going on, which Michael has illuminated and caused us to reflect on and think again. I think there's a great danger in the modern world that we will go for instant and absolute solutions to everything, and clearly that's not going to be the way forward. Michael, I'm so grateful. There are many phrases you use that will stick in my mind. This is not simply Putin's war, for example, and your devastating conclusion, which is a dark conclusion, but maybe a little gleam of light at the end of a long tunnel, is one that, again, we will all think about. It's been such a privilege to have you give this very distinguished Edmund Burke Lecture. I ought to report for everyone's benefit that it will be, because it's been recorded, made available as a recording, which will be seen, I know, from past experience, by hundreds of extra people who weren't here tonight, although it was a big audience actually tuning in on the night. The text will appear in the next edition of the Annual Register of World Events. I should have explained at the beginning that I actually chair the advisory board of the Annual Register, and this development over the past many years now, to have an Edmund Burke Lecture in memory of our founder, has grown from strength to strength. I don't want to belittle any of the previous speakers by saying that yours is the most outstanding of the lot, but it's certainly up there with the best. It's been a terrific evening, and we're so very grateful to you for giving this lecture. And can I thank at the same time ProQuest Clarivet for their support, for our wonderful team of technicians that have made it possible, headed by Sabrina and Ashley tonight, and of course all the people who attended the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I hope that Michael enjoyed it too. Thank you very much indeed.
Great, thanks so much, Alastair. I'll just echo your words, say thank you to Michael for presenting, and thank you to Andrew and Alastair for handling the Q&A and your introductions. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and ACRL with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the session, and we hope to see you again in the near future on another webinar.
Thank you very much indeed. Good night, everyone.